Picture this: a bustling city, its streets alive with merchants, its markets overflowing with goods from distant lands. For centuries, it thrives, its people confident in the unshakable strength of their civilization. Then, almost overnight, everything changes. The ships stop arriving, the warehouses stand empty, the once great empire begins to starve, not from war or natural disaster, but from something far more insidious: the collapse of the invisible threads that held it all together. This isn't fiction. It's a pattern that's repeated itself across history, toppling kingdoms and erasing cultures that seemed unstoppable. Today, we're diving into the stories of 25 ancient supply chains whose failures didn't just disrupt trade, they shattered empires. Think about how reliant we are today on the delicate web of global logistics. A single delay at a port or a shortage of truck drivers can send shockwaves through entire industries. Now, imagine that fragility magnified across the ancient world, where a broken trade route could mean the difference between prosperity and collapse. From the Roman Empire's reliance on Egyptian grain to the Ming Dynasty's abrupt abandonment of oceanic trade, these supply chains were the lifeblood of civilizations, and when they faltered, the consequences were catastrophic. What's truly startling is how many of these collapses weren't slow declines but sudden, irreversible breakdowns, leaving societies with no time to adapt. But why does this matter to us now? Because history has a way of rhyming. The same vulnerabilities that doomed ancient empires' over-reliance on distant resources, political instability, environmental pressures, are echoes we hear in today's headlines. By unraveling these 25 stories, we're not just exploring the past, we're holding up a mirror to our own interconnected world. So join me as we trace the rise and fall of these ancient networks and discover the chilling lessons they hold for the modern age. The next time you walk into a well-stocked supermarket, ask yourself, how different are we really from those who came before us? The Mediterranean world of the late Bronze Age was a marvel of interconnected prosperity, a web of trade routes stretching from the palaces of Mycenae to the ports of Egypt, where ships carried not just goods but the very foundations of civilization itself. At the heart of this system lay bronze, the alloy that fueled armies, built monuments, and defined an era. But bronze required two ingredients: copper from Cyprus and tin from as far away as Afghanistan. Like a delicate house of cards, this network thrived as long as every piece stayed in place. Then, around 1200 BCE, the cards began to fall. Drought scorched harvests, starving cities that depended on imported grain. Raiders known to history only as the mysterious Sea Peoples sank ships and burned coastal cities, severing trade links one by one. Without tin, bronze production ground to a halt. Without bronze, armies couldn't arm themselves and artisans couldn't craft tools. The Hittite Empire, once a superpower, dissolved into abandoned ruins. Mycenae's towering citadels emptied, their writing systems forgotten. Even Egypt, though it survived, reeled from the shockwaves. What followed wasn't just a recession, but a near-total reset. 3 centuries, so bleak historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Here's what's chilling: these societies didn't see it coming. Clay tablets from the era reveal frantic, unanswered pleas for grain and military aid, like final messages in a bottle. The lesson written in their ruins isn't just about trade routes breaking down, it's about civilizations so specialized, so dependent on distant partners, that they had no plan B. When the ships stopped sailing, knowledge itself disappeared. The art of writing, the secrets of masonry, the memory of how things were done. It's a warning etched in history: complexity creates fragility. And when a system is too interconnected to fail, sometimes it does exactly that. Rome's skyline was built on bread. Not marble, not legions, but the steady flow of grain ships from Alexandria, carrying enough Egyptian wheat each year to fill over 600 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The empire's entire social contract rested on this simple bargain: free grain for the masses in exchange for political stability. But that bargain had a fatal flaw. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it wasn't just Pompeii that suffered. Ash clouds blotted out the sun across the Mediterranean, chilling the climate and withering Nile harvests. Grain shipments slowed to a trickle. Within months, Rome's bread lines turned restless, then furious. The Emperor Titus emptied the treasury, buying emergency supplies from Sicily and North Africa, but prices still skyrocketed. A loaf of bread that cost 2 copper coins now demanded 20. Workers spent entire days' wages just to feed their families. And here's where Rome's systemic vulnerability became undeniable. They'd allowed their food security to hinge on a single river valley thousands of miles away. Egyptian granaries weren't just convenient, they were the empire's lifeline with no viable backup. By the 3rd century, when political chaos in Alexandria disrupted shipments again, Rome's urban poor revolted, burning markets and clashing with Praetorian guards. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a civilization that had gambled everything on a supply chain stretched too thin. What makes this story resonate today isn't just the parallels, like how 40% of the world's wheat now comes from just 3 countries, but the uncomfortable truth it reveals about centralized systems. Rome didn't collapse because Egypt failed. It collapsed because Rome had no plan for when Egypt would fail. Modern supply chains might be faster and more resilient, but they're still vulnerable to the same Achilles heel, overconfidence. The ships will always come, the harvests will always hold until they don't. And when that moment arrives, as it did for Rome, the difference between adaptation and collapse often comes down to one question: did you build flexibility into the system, or bet everything on a single thread holding firm? The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was a living artery pulsing with the lifeblood of continents. For over 1,000 years, camel caravans carried more than silk and spices. They transported languages, religions, and technologies that shaped civilizations from Rome to Chang'an. But in the 14th century, this vibrant network met its silent killer, not an invading army, but something far smaller and deadlier. When the Black Death emerged from Central Asia's steppes, it didn't just spread along the Silk Road, it weaponized it. Merchants unwittingly carried fleas infected with plague in their cargo, turning bustling caravanserais into mass graves. Within decades, entire trading cities like Samarkand saw their populations halved. Fear became the new currency, and as survivors barricaded themselves inside city walls, the routes that had once enriched the world now lay empty, choked by weeds and paranoia. Yet the plague alone didn't kill the Silk Road. Its final blow came from an empire's decision to retreat. In 1368, the newly established Ming Dynasty looked at the chaos beyond its borders and made a fateful choice: isolation. Emperor Hongwu banned private overseas trade, dismantling China's once mighty merchant fleets. His successors doubled down, building the Great Wall not just to keep invaders out, but to seal China off from the outside world. The message was clear: prosperity would no longer come from distant markets but from self-sufficiency. The consequences were staggering. Without Chinese silk and porcelain flowing west, entire industries in Persia and Venice collapsed. Without Central Asian horses, Ming armies grew weaker. And without the constant exchange of ideas, innovation stagnated across Eurasia. The world's first experiment in globalization didn't fade, it shattered. What makes this collapse so haunting is how avoidable it was. The plague eventually receded, but the walls stayed up. Unlike Rome's desperate scramble for grain or the Bronze Age's resource shortages, the Ming had alternatives. Their isolation wasn't forced by circumstance but chosen out of fear, and that's where the modern parallel cuts deepest. When COVID-19 disrupted global supply chains, nations hoarded medical supplies and closed borders. Some called it temporary, but history whispers a warning. Retreating inward might feel safe in crisis, but the cost of staying there can last centuries. The Silk Road story teaches us that connectivity isn't just about goods. It's about the invisible threads of progress that snap when we stop reaching outward. After all, the Dark Ages didn't begin with a war or a famine. They began with empty roads. High in the Andes, the Inca Empire stretched across 2,500 miles of mountain peaks and jungle valleys, a realm so vast its rulers needed something extraordinary to hold it together. Their solution, the Cahokia, a 25,000-mile road network that would put modern highways to shame. This wasn't just a series of paths, it was an engineering marvel, with suspension bridges woven from grass, staircases carved into cliffsides, and relay stations stocked with fresh runners who could carry messages at a pace of 150 miles a day. In many ways, it functioned like the internet of its time: instant communication, seamless logistics, and centralized control. But that very strength became its fatal weakness. When Francisco Pizarro and his band of conquistadors arrived in 1532, they didn't need to conquer the entire empire. They just needed to cut the wires. By capturing Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, at the city of Cajamarca, the Spanish gained control over the entire system. Imagine a hacker taking down a server farm, except here, the servers were human. Without orders from the top, regional governors froze, messengers stopped running. Armies that could have crushed the invaders stood paralyzed, waiting for commands that never came. The roads that had once unified the empire now served as highways for Spanish cavalry, allowing them to exploit divisions and crush resistance with terrifying speed. What's staggering isn't just how quickly the Inca fell, it's how avoidable their collapse might have been. Unlike the Romans or the Ming, the Inca had built redundancy into their physical infrastructure. Their roads included alternate routes and backup storage depots, but they'd made one critical error: all decision-making flowed through a single, sacred ruler. No emperor, no empire. Modern tech giants might recognize this dilemma. Companies like Google or Amazon rely on vast, centralized data networks efficient until a single point of failure brings everything crashing down. The Inca story isn't just about roads, it's about the danger of confusing connectivity with resilience. A network is only as strong as its ability to adapt when the center vanishes. Centuries later, the Cahokia still snakes through the mountains, a ghost of what once was. Its stones whisper a lesson we're still learning today. You can build the most advanced system in the world, but if it depends entirely on a handful of choke points, whether they're emperors, servers, or supply hubs, you're not building an empire. You're building a house of cards, and history has a way of dealing the same hand over and over again. Venice didn't just trade salt, it weaponized it. For centuries, the city's merchants controlled Europe's most precious commodity, not through force but through sheer logistical brilliance. Their secret, a network of salt pans across the Mediterranean, where seawater evaporated into mountains of white gold. Salt preserved fish for armies, cured hides for leather, and most crucially, flavored the bland diets of medieval Europe. With this monopoly, Venice became the middleman for the spice trade, swapping salt for pepper and cinnamon from the east. Their wealth built marble palaces that seemed to float on water, a testament to the power of controlling something everyone needed but few could produce. Then, in 1498, a single ship changed everything. When Vasco da Gama's fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, it didn't just discover a new route to India, it rendered Venice obsolete. Portuguese caravels loaded with spices straight from the source could undercut Venetian prices by half. Almost overnight, the warehouses lining Venice's canals filled with unsellable cargo. Merchants who'd grown fat on markups watched their fortunes evaporate like the brine in their salt pans. The city's ruling council, the Doge, made desperate attempts to blockade the new sea routes, even conspiring with the Ottomans. But it was too late. The game had changed, and Venice hadn't just lost its edge, it had failed to see the board was being redrawn. What makes this collapse so jarring isn't the disruption itself, but Venice's utter inability to adapt. They'd known about Portuguese explorations for decades, yet clung to the illusion that their dominance was unshakable. Sound familiar? Think of how Kodak invented the digital camera but dismissed it to protect film sales, or how Blockbuster laughed off Netflix's mail-order DVDs. Venice's story isn't about a lack of warning, it's about the arrogance of monopoly. When you control the entire market, innovation feels like a threat rather than an opportunity. Today's corporate giants might see themselves as Venetians sitting atop unassailable empires, but history whispers a chilling reminder: monopolies don't die from competition. They die from disbelief. The real danger isn't the rival who copies your model, it's the one who invents a model you can't even recognize. When the rules change, the winners aren't those who built the tallest towers, but those who are willing to tear them down first. Venice's canals still shimmer with reflected glory, but their lesson is written in the silt beneath. No empire, no matter how brilliant, is immune to the tides of change. The Baltic Sea in the 14th century wasn't just a body of water. It was a battleground of commerce patrolled by the red-sailed ships of the Hanseatic League. This alliance of merchant cities from Lubeck to Novgorod didn't just dominate trade, they wrote the rules. Their ledgers dictated the price of timber in London, the flow of furs to Flanders, and even the political alliances of kings. For 200 years, the League's wealth seemed as unshakable as the granite walls of its counting houses. Then the world grew colder. The Little Ice Age crept in like a thief. By the mid-1500s, winters that once lasted months now dragged on for half the year. The Baltic, once a highway of commerce, froze solid, trapping fleets in harbors for seasons at a time. Salted herring, the League's most lucrative export, rotted in barrels as ice blocked shipping lanes. But the real crisis wasn't just the cold, it was what the cold revealed. With resources scarce, the League's members turned on each other. Lubeck and Danzig, once brothers in trade, waged naval wars over dwindling grain shipments. Merchants who'd sworn oaths of mutual protection now undercut each other to survive. The very cooperation that built the League became its undoing. What makes this collapse so unsettling is how modern it feels. The Hanseatic cities didn't fail because they lacked ingenuity or wealth. They failed because they couldn't imagine their environment changing. Their entire system was built on predictable seasons and stable trade routes. When the climate shifted, they had no contingency plans, no diversified supply chains. Sound familiar? Today's corporations face eerily similar risks, from drought-strained shipping channels to hurricane-battered ports. The League's story isn't just about medieval merchants. It's a blueprint for how interconnected economies fracture when nature stops cooperating. Yet there's a twist in this tale. A handful of Hanseatic cities like Hamburg and Bremen adapted. They invested in land-based trade networks, pivoted to new commodities, and survived long after the League's collapse. Their lesson: resilience isn't about strength, it's about flexibility. The next time you hear about a modern supply chain disrupted by floods or wildfires, remember the Hanseatic League. The climate crisis isn't new, only the scale has changed, and history's message is clear. The empires that endure aren't those with the most power, but those who prepare for the world to turn against them. The island of Crete thrived under the Minoans, a civilization so advanced they built multi-story palaces with flushing toilets, while most of Europe still lived in huts. But their true power didn't come from stone, it came from wood. Their fleets, sleek and fast, dominated the Aegean, connecting a vast trade network that stretched from Egypt to Sardinia. These weren't just merchant vessels, they were floating fortresses patrolling the seas to protect shipments of olive oil, pottery, and the priceless purple dye made from murex snails. For centuries, the Minoans weren't just traders, they were the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean's economic heartbeat. Then, in an instant, the heart stopped. Around 1600 BCE, the volcano on Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted with a force 50 times greater than Krakatoa. Tsunamis as tall as 10-story buildings radiated outward, smashing into Crete's northern harbors. But the waves weren't the worst of it. Ash clouds blotted out the sun for months, choking crops and poisoning freshwater supplies. Yet the Minoans might have survived even that, if not for what they lost in the harbor that day. Their entire navy, the backbone of their empire, lay shattered, hulls splintered, oars snapped like twigs. The ships that had once carried their wealth now littered the seafloor, taking with them the ability to trade, to defend, to exist as a regional power. Here's what's haunting. The Minoans didn't vanish because of the eruption itself. They vanished because their entire identity was tied to something infinitely fragile, a fleet that could be erased in hours. Without ships, they couldn't import grain to feed their people. Without ships, they couldn't export olive oil to pay for foreign luxuries. And without ships, they couldn't prevent opportunistic invaders like the Mycenaeans from crossing the suddenly undefended waters. Within a generation, the grand palaces stood empty, their frescoes of dolphins and bull leapers fading under layers of dust. Modern ports from Shanghai to Los Angeles might want to take note. Today's supply chains are exponentially more resilient, but they share the same vulnerability the Minoans discovered too late: concentration. When all your eggs are in one geographic basket, whether it's a fleet in Crete or microchips from Taiwan, disaster doesn't just disrupt. It dismantles. The Minoans didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they were too strong in one single, perishable way. And that's a lesson etched not in stone, but in the silent wreckage of ships that never sailed home. The Assyrian Empire didn't just wield iron, it was iron. From the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, their armies marched under the glint of helmets and spear tips forged from a metal so superior, it might as well have been magic. While rivals struggled with brittle bronze, Assyrian smiths turned ore into weapons that carved history's first true military-industrial complex. Conquered lands fed them grain, slaves built their cities, and mines from Anatolia to the Zagros Mountains supplied the raw materials to keep their war machine thundering forward. But iron, for all its strength, had a hidden weakness. It needed constant fuel. And when the empire's own subjects decided they'd had enough, they didn't just rebel. They turned off the tap. It began with whispers in the provinces. The Assyrians had mastered terror as a tool of control: mass deportations, public flayings, entire cities razed as warnings. But fear only works until it doesn't. By the late 7th century, subject kingdoms from Babylon to Egypt realized something revolutionary. The empire's power wasn't infinite. It depended on their labor, their mines, their roads. So when Babylonian King Nabopolassar rallied a coalition in 626 BCE, his strategy wasn't just to fight the Assyrians, it was to starve them. Rebel forces systematically severed trade routes, burning bridges and ambushing ore caravans. Within years, Assyria's armory sat empty. Smiths who once hammered out 10,000 arrowheads a month now scraped rust from old blades. The unthinkable happened. An empire that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries couldn't even arm its own troops. What's chilling isn't just the speed of collapse, it's how predictable it was. Assyrian tablets reveal officials pleading for ore shipments that never arrived, their panic etched in cuneiform. The men of Urartu have blocked the mountain passes, reads one desperate message. No iron comes. Modern parallels scream for attention. Think of how today's tech giants scramble when a single Taiwanese semiconductor plant slows production, or how Europe's energy markets convulsed when Russian gas supplies dwindled. The Assyrians weren't defeated by a stronger army, they were undone by their own brittle supply lines. Their story isn't about losing battles, it's about winning them all until the day you can't even field an army. Yet there's a twist in this tale. The rebels didn't destroy Assyria's mines, they simply took them over. Within decades, Babylon's own armies marched with Assyrian iron, now turned against its creators. That's the final, brutal lesson. Empires built on extraction always assume the resources will flow forever. But history has a way of teaching the same lesson again and again. Power isn't about who controls the weapons, it's about who controls what makes them. And when the oppressed decide to stop feeding the machine, even iron empires turn to dust. Angkor Wat's towering spires didn't rise from faith alone, they were built on water. The Khmer Empire's genius wasn't just in stone carving but in hydraulics, a network of canals, reservoirs, and rice paddies so vast it turned the Cambodian jungle into an agricultural powerhouse. At its peak, the Baray, or water reservoirs, held over 50 million cubic meters of liquid gold, enough to feed 1 million people. But water, for all its life-giving power, is a fickle foundation. By the 15th century, Angkor's liquid empire was cracking. Droughts parched the land while monsoon floods dumped choking silt into canals. The once mighty reservoirs shrank to muddy puddles. Rice yields plummeted, and with no grain to pay laborers or feed armies, the Khmer's god kings found their divine authority evaporating faster than the monsoon rains. What's haunting about Angkor's collapse isn't just the scale, it's the irony. The Khmer had mastered water so completely they'd forgotten its fragility. Their entire society revolved around a single, precarious system, monsoon-dependent canals feeding rice paddies that fed the empire. When the rains failed, as they did more frequently during the medieval warm period, there were no backups. No drought-resistant crops, no alternative trade networks to import food. Just mile after mile of cracked earth where shimmering reservoirs once stood. Modern cities from Cape Town to Chen, I might recognize the warning signs. When a civilization bets everything on one water source, it's not building an empire, it's building a time bomb. Yet Angkor's story holds a twist. Recent archaeological work reveals the Khmer didn't just vanish, they adapted. As the canals failed, people migrated toward the Mekong Delta, trading temple building for river trade. The empire collapsed, but the culture survived by abandoning its rigid dependence on a single system. That's the lesson etched into Angkor's moss-covered stones. Resilience isn't about clinging to what worked yesterday. It's about knowing when to let go. Today's megacities, sucking aquifers dry or depending on single rivers, might want to listen. The Khmer didn't fall because they lacked engineering brilliance. They fell because brilliance blinded them to the need for Plan B. And when the water stops flowing, no amount of stone carvings can quench a civilization's thirst. Deep in the sweltering jungles of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs didn't just discover rubber, they built an entire civilization on it. While most ancient cultures measured wealth in gold or grain, the Olmecs prized the sticky sap of the Castilla elastica tree, a resource so versatile it became the foundation of their economy, religion, and even their identity. They molded rubber into waterproof soles for sandals, adhesive for tool handles, and most famously, the heavy balls used in the sacred Mesoamerican ball game, a sport so central to their culture that losing it would be like Rome losing gladiatorial combat. But the Olmec's greatest strength hid a fatal flaw. Their entire society depended on a single, finite resource. The scale of their rubber production was staggering. Archaeological evidence suggests latex extraction sites operated like ancient factories, with laborers slashing tree bark to collect sap, then mixing it with morning glory vine juice to create durable rubber, a chemical innovation centuries ahead of its time. Trade routes carried bouncy rubber balls as far north as Arizona and as far south as Costa Rica, making the Olmecs the undisputed middlemen of Mesoamerica's first luxury commodity. Yet this very success sowed the seeds of collapse. Like modern clear-cutting, the Olmecs' harvesting methods were brutally efficient. Trees weren't tapped sustainably. They were gashed until they bled dry, leaving behind exhausted groves that could take decades to recover. By 400 BCE, the consequences became undeniable. Deforestation led to soil erosion, silt-choked rivers, and plummeting latex yields. Without rubber, the ball game, a ritual believed to maintain cosmic order, faded from practice. Trade networks unraveled as neighboring cultures found alternative suppliers. The Olmec heartland, once dotted with towering stone heads celebrating rubber wealth, became a shadow of its former self. What's haunting isn't just the ecological oversight, it's how avoidable the collapse was. The Maya, who later dominated the region, learned from this lesson, cultivating rubber trees in managed groves rather than strip mining wild stands. Today, the parallels are impossible to ignore. From overfished oceans to depleted aquifers, we're repeating the Olmec's mistake on a planetary scale. Their story isn't just about rubber, it's about the peril of treating renewable resources as infinite. The Castilla elastica trees eventually regrew, but by then, the Olmecs were already gone, their legacy reduced to silent stone faces gazing blindly from the jungle. A civilization that mastered chemistry and trade forgot one fundamental rule: no empire, no matter how ingenious, can outlast the land that feeds it. The Phoenicians didn't just sell purple dye, they sold exclusivity itself. Harvested from the mucus of rare sea snails, Tyrian purple required 12,000 mollusks to produce a single gram of pigment. The process stank like rotting fish, took weeks of labor, and cost more than its weight in silver. That was the point. In the ancient Mediterranean, purple wasn't just a color. It was a walking billboard of wealth, reserved for emperors, high priests, and anyone rich enough to flaunt their status in a shade no peasant could fake. For centuries, Phoenician merchants grew fat on this monopoly, their ships carrying bolts of purple cloth to every royal court from Carthage to Babylon. But their business model had a fatal flaw. What happens when everyone who matters already owns one? By the 1st century CE, the market reached saturation. Roman senators draped themselves in purple togas. Wealthy matrons demanded purple-dyed veils. Even middle-class merchants scraped together enough coin for a purple trim on their tunics. The very ubiquity that should have signaled success instead destroyed the product's magic. When Emperor Nero decreed that only the imperial family could wear true Tyrian purple, it wasn't just a power move, it was a desperate attempt to manufacture scarcity in a world drowning in faux luxury. Prices plummeted. Phoenician dye factories, once guarded like state secrets, stood abandoned along the Levantine coast. The same merchants who had grown rich convincing the world that purple meant power now faced a brutal truth: you can't sell exclusivity when it's no longer exclusive. This wasn't just an ancient version of a fad diet or a viral gadget. It was a textbook case of what economists now call a Veblen good. Named after sociologist Thorstein Veblen, these are products that become more desirable as they get more expensive because their value lies in signaling status, not utility. Think designer handbags or limited edition sneakers. The Phoenicians didn't just invent the concept, they rode it to prosperity until the wheels fell off. Modern luxury brands might recognize the warning signs. When Louis Vuitton slaps its logo on everything from keychains to pool floats, it risks the same fate as Tyrian purple, dilution. The moment a status symbol becomes accessible, the elites abandon it for something rarer. Yet there's a twist in this story. The Phoenicians didn't disappear, they pivoted. With the purple trade fading, they doubled down on something far more enduring: knowledge. Their alphabet became the foundation of Greek and Latin scripts. Their shipbuilding techniques revolutionized Mediterranean trade. In the end, their greatest legacy wasn't a color that faded, but ideas that lasted millennia. That's the real lesson hiding in the ruins of their dye vats. Empires built on selling exclusivity are fragile, but those built on sharing innovation. They're the ones history remembers. The next time you see a celebrity flaunting some outrageously priced, must-have item, ask yourself, are you looking at the next Tyrian purple, or just another bubble waiting to burst? The Gupta Empire didn't just mint gold coins, it breathed them. Under rulers like Chandragupta II, their currency became the lifeblood of an economic golden age, quite literally. Each coin, stamped with the emperor's likeness and Sanskrit inscriptions, wasn't just money. It was propaganda, art, and trust all hammered into one. Trade flourished from the Ganges to the Persian Gulf, with Gupta gold buying everything from Chinese silk to Arabian horses. But around the mid-5th century, something ominous happened. The coins started disappearing. Not from thieves or inflation, but from the earth itself. The empire's legendary gold mines, hidden deep in the Deccan Plateau, were running dry. At first, the shortage seemed manageable. Officials melted down older coins, thinning their gold content to stretch reserves. But like a gambler doubling down, this only accelerated the crisis. Merchants, sensing the devaluation, hoarded pure coins or demanded payment in silver. Regional governors, once loyal, began striking their own inferior currency, fracturing the empire's economic unity. Then came the final blow, the Huna invasions. These nomadic warriors from Central Asia didn't just sack cities, they targeted mints, seizing what little gold remained. By the time the dust settled, the Gupta economy wasn't just weakened, it was hollowed out. The same coins that had built temples and funded universities now gathered dust in abandoned treasuries. What makes this collapse so instructive isn't just the resource depletion, it's the domino effect. Without gold, the Gupta state couldn't pay soldiers, leaving borders undefended. Without soldiers, trade routes fell to bandits, starving cities of goods. And without trade, the empire's famed intellectuals dispersed, taking with them advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The so-called Golden Age of India didn't end with a bang, but with a whisper, the last clink of a coin rolling into oblivion. Modern economies might scoff at the idea of physical currency shortages in our digital age. But the Gupta's lesson isn't about gold. It's about dependency. Whether it's oil, semiconductors, or even data, any system that relies too heavily on a single resource is flirting with fragility. The Guptas thought their mines were infinite. Today, we make the same gamble with lithium for batteries or rare earth metals for tech. History's warning is clear. When the well runs dry, it's not just the water that vanishes. It's the entire civilization built atop it. In the dense jungles of Mesoamerica, Jade wasn't just a stone, it was the beating heart of Maya power. Rulers draped themselves in jade beads so heavy their burial masks alone could weigh 10 pounds. Warriors embedded jade in their teeth as a mark of valor. Even the gods demanded it. Ceremonial axes carved from the green gem were smashed as offerings in sacred cenotes. But this wasn't just about beauty or spirituality. Jade functioned as the Maya's version of a stock market, its value propped up by collective belief rather than inherent utility. And like all speculative bubbles, it was destined to pop. The scale of their obsession defied logic. At Capan, archaeologists found a single royal tomb containing over 25,000 jade objects, enough to bankrupt a small city-state. The problem: jade only came from a handful of mines in the Matogwa River Valley, controlled by a few powerful families. As demand skyrocketed, these elites gouged prices, creating artificial scarcity. Sound familiar? It's the same playbook modern diamond cartels would use millennia later, but the Maya took it further. They began trading jade on credit, with nobles accumulating debts equivalent to decades of harvests. The entire economy became a pyramid scheme where new jade had to keep flowing to pay off old promises. Then the cracks appeared. Overmining exhausted the easiest deposits, forcing laborers to dig deeper in landslide-prone cliffs. Death soared and revolt simmered among the workers. Meanwhile, climate change, the great disruptor of ancient civilizations, brought droughts that crippled agriculture. Suddenly, no one cared about jade when corn couldn't grow. City-states that had once bonded over trade now warred for survival. By the 9th century, the bubble burst spectacularly. Jade hoards were abandoned in panic, left scattered across plazas as elites fled collapsing cities. A single artifact tells the story: a half-carved jade pendant found in a workshop at Tikal, its craftsman's tools still lying nearby as if he'd walked away mid-stroke. What makes this collapse so eerily modern isn't just the speculative frenzy, it's the aftermath. Unlike gold or silver, jade had no practical use. You couldn't eat it, forge it into tools, or even trade it with outsiders once the Mayas' shared belief in its value vanished. It became what economists call a non-recourse asset, worthless the moment faith in it collapsed. Today's cryptocurrency traders might recognize the pattern. When a society bases its wealth on collective imagination rather than tangible needs, the line between empire and illusion becomes dangerously thin. Yet there's a twist the Maya never saw coming. Centuries later, when Spanish conquistadors arrived, they dismissed jade as green stones, valuing gold instead. The very substance that had fueled Maya civilization now lay ignored in the dirt, a cautionary tale written in emerald hues. The lesson isn't that jade was foolish. It's that any economy built on perception rather than resilience is one bad harvest or one crisis of confidence away from vanishing into the jungle. The next time you hear about a can't-lose investment, remember the Maya. Bubbles don't burst because people stop believing. They burst because they were never real to begin with. At the height of its power, the Aksumite Empire wasn't just a kingdom. It was the Red Sea's toll booth. Perched atop the Horn of Africa, Aksum's ports bustled with ships from Rome, India, and Persia, all paying tariffs to dock at Adulis, the empire's golden gateway. Ivory, frankincense, and exotic spices flowed through its warehouses, while Aksumite coins inscribed with the faces of kings who called themselves Sons of the Sun circulated from Alexandria to Sri Lanka. This wasn't just commerce, it was a geographic jackpot. Then nature cashed in its chips. The first signs were subtle. Sandbars, shifting with the currents, began silting up the harbor at Adulis. Larger ships struggled to dock, forcing merchants to unload cargo onto smaller boats, a costly delay. Then came the floods, seasonal rains growing more erratic, washed sediment downstream, choking the harbor further. Within decades, what had once been a deepwater port became a labyrinth of mudbanks. The empire's lifeline wasn't being cut, it was being buried alive. Aksum's rulers responded with desperate ingenuity. They dug canals, dredged channels, even built new docks farther downstream. But geography doesn't negotiate. By the 7th century, Adulis was a ghost town, its stone quays jutting uselessly over dry land. The consequences rippled outward. Without port taxes, Aksum couldn't pay its armies. Without imports, its artisans ran out of glass, metals, even the ink used for royal proclamations. The empire didn't collapse in battle or rebellion. It starved to death on dry land, watching as trade shifted to Arab-controlled ports like Jeddah. What's haunting about Aksum's fall isn't the drama, but the banality. There were no volcanoes, no barbarian hordes, just sand piling up grain by grain. Modern coastal cities from Venice to New Orleans might recognize the creeping threat. When your wealth comes from a coastline, you're always one storm, one current shift away from obsolescence. Yet the cruelest twist came later. Aksum's descendants, the Ethiopians, turned inward, building churches carved into mountains rather than ports facing the sea. Their new power came from isolation, not connection. It's a lesson written in the silt of abandoned harbors. Empires built on geography can't outlast the ground beneath their feet. The sea that made Aksum didn't betray it. It simply moved on, and in the end, that's the most terrifying collapse of all, not a bang, but a slow, quiet turning of the tides. The Tang dynasty didn't just drink tea, they turned it into money. In 8th century China, tea leaves became so valuable they functioned as currency, traded alongside silk and copper coins in bustling marketplaces. The government even accepted tea as tax payment, a practice that transformed peasant farms into de facto mints. But this wasn't just a cultural shift, it was the world's first documented commodity bubble, and its collapse would expose the dangers of an economy built on a single crop. At its peak, the tea trade resembled a gold rush. Farmers across southern China ripped up food crops to plant tea bushes, lured by prices that tripled within a generation. Wealthy merchants stockpiled leaves like bullion, while speculators traded futures contracts on harvests not yet picked. The government, addicted to tea taxes that funded its armies and canals, encouraged the frenzy. But like all booms, this one hit a ticking clock. By the mid-9th century, supply overwhelmed demand. Tea warehouses overflowed with unsold inventory. Prices cratered by 80%, dragging down everyone from aristocratic investors to pickers paid in leaves now worthless as kindling. The fallout was catastrophic. Peasants who'd mortgaged land to plant tea faced starvation when they couldn't grow food or sell their harvests. In 874, a failed tea merchant named Wang Xianji ignited a rebellion that swelled into the Huangqiao uprising, a blood-soaked revolt killing millions and crippling the Tang regime. The very leaves that had stabilized the economy now fueled its unraveling. What makes this story resonate today isn't just the speculative mania, it's the policy failures that magnified it. The Tang court, desperate to maintain tax revenue, kept promoting tea cultivation even as markets screamed, "Glut." Sound familiar? Modern parallels, from the American Dust Bowl caused by wheat overproduction to Venezuela's oil-dependent collapse, show how hard governments cling to monocultures, even when the writing's on the wall. Yet the Tang's tea crash holds an unexpected silver lining. As chaos spread, some regions adapted by diversifying into porcelain and paper production industries that would later define China's economic resilience. The lesson isn't that commodities are dangerous, it's that no single crop, no matter how lucrative, should ever become the sole pillar of an empire. Because when the bubble bursts, it's not just investors who pay the price. It's the entire civilization built atop it. The Byzantine Empire didn't just wear silk, they weaponized it. For centuries, Constantinople sat at the crossroads of the world, raking in fortunes by controlling the most coveted fabric of the ancient world. But their dominance wasn't built on looms or craftsmanship. It was built on theft. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian pulled off history's most lucrative heist, smuggling live silkworms out of China in hollowed-out walking sticks carried by daring monks. Overnight, Byzantium broke China's 1,000-year monopoly, turning their capital into a silk factory where the worms munched on mulberry leaves and spun fortunes for the imperial treasury. At first, the scheme was flawless. Byzantine silk, shimmering with gold thread and dyed in colors so vivid they seemed stolen from the sunset, became the ultimate status symbol. European kings paid in silver by the pound just to trim their robes with it. The empire taxed every bolt that passed through its gates, amassing wealth so vast it funded Justinian's wars, his monuments, even his disastrous attempt to reconquer Rome. But secrets like silk unravel eventually. By the 9th century, Arab traders had bribed or smuggled their own silkworms out of Constantinople, then the Italians. Then the Spanish. Each leak diluted the monopoly further until silk production spread like dandelion seeds across Europe. The Byzantine response was tragically predictable. They doubled down on exclusivity. Emperors passed draconian laws, threatening death to anyone caught exporting silkworms. Craftsmen were confined to guarded workshops, their techniques deemed state secrets. But the harder they clutched, the faster their advantage slipped away. By the 12th century, Venetian merchants were producing silk just as fine and undercutting Byzantine prices by half. The empire's once bottomless coffers ran dry, forcing desperate rulers to melt down church silver just to pay soldiers. What makes this collapse so instructive isn't the espionage, it's the failure to adapt. The Byzantines mistook a temporary advantage for permanent power. They could have pivoted to new dyes, innovative weaving techniques, or even diversified their economy. Instead, they bet everything on guarding a secret that was always destined to spread. Modern tech giants might recognize the pattern. How many companies have poured billions into patent lawsuits while competitors leapfrog them with better ideas? Yet there's a bittersweet coda to this tale. Byzantine silk didn't vanish, it evolved. The intricate patterns woven in Constantinople's workshops became the foundation of Italian Renaissance textiles. The very knowledge the empire tried so hard to hoard ended up enriching the world. That's the paradox at the heart of trade secrets. The tighter you grip them, the more they crumble. But let them go, and sometimes, just sometimes, they grow into something even greater. The next time you see a luxury brand suing over counterfeit handbags, remember the Byzantines. Monopolies aren't forever, and the greatest legacies aren't built on what you keep, but on what you accidentally set free. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer the world, he connected it. At its peak, the Mongol Empire's postal system, known as the Yam, operated with a speed and efficiency that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telegraph. Relay stations spaced every 20 miles housed fresh horses, armed guards, and couriers ready to sprint day and night. Messages could travel up to 200 miles in a single day, faster than any army or rumor. This wasn't just mail delivery, it was the nervous system of history's largest land empire, pulsing with intelligence, trade deals, and imperial decrees. But like all networks, the Yam had one fatal weakness. It only worked if everyone played by the same rules. The system's brilliance lay in its simplicity. A courier carrying a paisa, a golden passport engraved with the Great Khan's seal, could demand food, shelter, and a fresh horse at any station. Local villages supplied the resources, knowing refusal meant death. In return, they enjoyed safe passage along trade routes and protection from bandits. For nearly a century, information flowed like water across the steppes, binding together territories stretching from Korea to Hungary. Then in 1260, everything changed. Kublai Khan's victory in the Toluid Civil War didn't just split the empire, it shattered the trust holding the Yam together. Suddenly, rival Khans began intercepting couriers, delaying messages, or worse, spreading disinformation. A decree from Kublai might take weeks to reach Persia, only to be contradicted by a rival's fake edict. Governors, unsure which orders to follow, grew paranoid. Trade routes once patrolled by Mongol cavalry became hunting grounds for mercenaries and thieves. The empire didn't collapse from rebellion or invasion, it starved from information atrophy. Without real-time communication, the Mongols lost their greatest weapon, speed. Modern parallels leap to mind. Imagine if today's internet splintered into warring factions, with tech giants selectively throttling data or governments hijacking DNS servers. The Mongols' Yam wasn't just a postal service, it was a prototype for centralized information networks, and its failure reveals a timeless truth. Connectivity creates power, but only as long as everyone agrees on whose messages matter. The moment that trust fractures, the system doesn't adapt, it implodes. Yet buried in this collapse lies an ironic twist. The Yam's remnants didn't vanish, they evolved. Marco Polo described relay stations still operating decades later, now serving merchants instead of khans. Silk Road traders repurposed the network, carrying not imperial decrees but spices, gunpowder, and fittingly, news. The lesson isn't that communication systems fail, it's that they outlive the empires that built them, often becoming something far more enduring. The next time you send an email across continents in seconds, remember the Mongol couriers. Speed alone doesn't sustain empires, but the roads built for messages, they might just outlast history itself. The Swahili coast glittered with wealth, its whitewashed cities like Kilwa and Zanzibar buzzing with traders from as far as China and Portugal. But their prosperity wasn't built on gold or spices. It rested on something far more fragile, the tusks of elephants. For centuries, Swahili merchants shipped ivory in staggering quantities, carving it into everything from intricate pilgrimage crosses for European nobles to ceremonial hairpins for Ming Dynasty elites. The demand seemed endless, and the prophets built palaces with coral walls so thick they withstood cannon fire. Yet no one stopped to ask, what happens when the elephants run out? By the 15th century, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Hunting parties had to trek deeper inland, sometimes for months, to find herds. The once plentiful soft gold now arrived in trickles, forcing merchants to pay inflated prices to middlemen from the interior. Then came the tipping point. Portuguese records from 1520 describe ships leaving Mogadishu with half-empty holds. The elephants hadn't just dwindled, they'd vanished from entire regions, and with them went the lifeblood of Swahili commerce. What's chilling isn't just the ecological oversight, it's the economic blindness. These were sophisticated traders who'd mastered monsoon winds and currency exchange, yet they'd built no fallback industries. When ivory dried up, there was no plan B. No alternative exports, just empty harbors where house once jostled for dock space. By the time the Omani Arabs took control in the 17th century, cities like Kilwa were shadows of their former selves, their grand mosques crumbling beneath the weight of neglect. Modern parallels sting like salt in a wound. Think of oil-dependent nations watching renewables eclipse fossil fuels, or single factory towns decimated when manufacturing moves overseas. The Swahili didn't fail because they lacked resources, they failed because they couldn't imagine those resources ending. Their story isn't about conservation, It's about the peril of betting an entire civilization on one fleeting advantage. Yet buried in the ruins of their coral palaces lies an unexpected lesson. Some Swahili merchants did adapt, pivoting to the slave trade, a dark turn that only postponed collapse. The real tragedy: they'd once traded in something far more sustainable, knowledge. Their navigational skills and multilingual crews could have made them the Google of the Indian Ocean. Instead, they clung to ivory until the last tusk was sold. The next time you hear a politician promise eternal prosperity from a single industry, remember the Swahili coast. Extinction isn't just a biological reality, it's an economic one. And empires that mistake abundance for infinity always learn that lesson too late. Beneath the towering earthen mounds of Cahokia, a metropolis thrived on something far more valuable than corn copper. Around the year 1000, this Mississippian city-state controlled a trade network stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, its artisans hammering raw copper into ceremonial axes, ornate headdresses, and tools that symbolized both power and spiritual connection. The metal didn't just build wealth, it built an entire cosmology, with Cahokia's rulers claiming divine authority as intermediaries between the earthly and supernatural realms. But copper, unlike the soil that nourished their crops, was finite, and when it vanished, so did Cahokia's golden age. The scale of their copper consumption was staggering. Archaeologists have found workshops where craftsmen flattened nuggets into paper-thin sheets, a technique requiring pound after pound of raw material for a single ritual object. Elite burials contained enough copper to outfit entire villages. One chieftain's grave held over 20,000 pearls of the metal, each painstakingly rolled by hand. Yet the ore didn't come from Cahokia's backyard. It traveled nearly 1,000 miles from Lake Superior mines, carried by traders along routes that functioned like ancient interstate highways. Like modern supply chains dependent on rare earth minerals, Cahokia's entire political structure hinged on a resource they couldn't replenish. By the 13th century, the cracks became undeniable. Copper artifacts grew thinner, smaller, often recycled from older pieces. Then came the substitutions, shells mimicking copper's luster, painted carvings replacing metal ornaments. The final blow wasn't war or famine, but something far more mundane: depletion. The mines around Lake Superior, worked for centuries, simply couldn't keep pace with demand. Without fresh shipments, Cahokia's artisans fell idle. Without new ceremonial goods to distribute, chiefs lost their divine legitimacy. The Grand Plaza, where copper once gleamed under the sun, became a marketplace of diminishing returns. What makes Cahokia's collapse so unsettling isn't just the resource exhaustion, it's the cultural unraveling that followed. Copper wasn't merely functional, it was foundational to their identity. When French explorers arrived centuries later, they found the mounds abandoned, the descendants of Cahokia's people living in scattered villages with no memory of metalworking. A civilization that had traded across a continent reverted to subsistence farming, its grandest innovations forgotten. Modern parallels whisper through this story. Think of lithium-dependent tech economies or nations staking their futures on single commodities like oil or rare minerals. Cahokia didn't fail because they lacked ingenuity. They failed because they couldn't imagine a world where the copper stopped coming. Yet hidden in their downfall lies a glimmer of resilience. Some Cahokians adapted, shifting to local materials like flint and bone. Others migrated, joining distant communities that valued different skills. The lesson isn't that resource dependence dooms societies, it's that survival belongs to those who diversify before the crisis hits. The next time you hold a smartphone filled with conflict minerals, remember Cahokia's silent mounds. Progress built on a single pillar isn't progress, It's a countdown. The Persian Royal Road wasn't just a highway, it was an ancient superhighway stretching over 1,500 miles from the bustling markets of Susa to the Aegean coast. Built by Darius I in the 5th century BCE, this engineering marvel had way stations every 18 miles, fresh horses for royal couriers, and garrisons to keep bandits at bay. Messages could race from one end of the empire to the other in just 7 days, faster than any army could march. But speed wasn't the road's true power, it was control. By monopolizing the fastest route for trade and information, the Persian Empire didn't just move goods, it dictated the flow of wealth itself. Yet empires decay from the inside out. By the 4th century BCE, the Royal Road's legendary efficiency began to crumble under the weight of its own success. Local governors, tasked with maintaining their stretches of the highway, realized they could skim taxes from merchants or demand bribes for safe passage. Bandits, once kept in check by Persian patrols, found that corrupt officials would look the other way for a cut of the loot. The very system designed to prevent chaos became its enabler. Merchants who once raced along the road now traveled in armed caravans, their progress slowed by endless checkpoints and the constant threat of ambush. The economic ripple effects were devastating. Prices for goods skyrocketed as transport costs ate into profits. Luxury items like Babylonian textiles or Bactrian spices, once commonplace in Persian markets, grew scarce. But the real crisis wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The Royal Road had been more than pavement, it was a symbol of imperial order. When bandits could strike with impunity and officials acted like thieves, the message to the empire's subjects was clear. The king's authority stopped at the next bend in the road. Modern parallels sting like desert sand in the eyes. Think of crumbling highways in once great industrial nations, where potholes delay shipments and graft inflates costs. Or consider digital roads like undersea internet cables, vulnerable to sabotage or corporate throttling. The Persians didn't lose their empire to Alexander's armies overnight. They eroded it mile by mile, toll by toll, as the rot of corruption seeped into the foundation of their power. Yet buried in this collapse lies a paradox. The Royal Road didn't vanish when Persia fell. Alexander used it, the Romans expanded it, even the Silk Road borrowed its blueprint. Infrastructure outlives empires, but only if someone maintains it. The next time you hit a pothole or curse a delayed shipment, remember Darius' lesson. Roads don't collapse from heavy use, they collapse from neglected trust. The towering sandstone walls of Choco Canyon still echo with the whispers of the Anasazi, a civilization that thrived in the American Southwest for centuries before vanishing into the desert wind. At their peak, these ancient ones built sprawling multi-story pueblos, engineered sophisticated irrigation systems, and traded turquoise and macaw feathers across vast distances. But their true lifeline wasn't stone or feathers, it was golden kernels of maize, cultivated in carefully managed fields that transformed the arid landscape into a breadbasket. Then the rain stopped coming. Tree rings tell the grim story. Between 1125 and 1180, the region suffered back-to-back droughts so severe they'd make modern climate scientists shudder. Annual rainfall dropped by nearly half and temperatures soared. Anasazi farmers who'd spent generations coaxing corn from the desert watched their crops wither in the blistering sun. Archaeologists have found granaries at Choco Canyon that once held enough maize to feed thousands, now empty, their floors swept clean by desperate hands. The Anasazi didn't just lose their food supply, they lost their social glue. In a culture where surplus grain funded elaborate ceremonies and cemented political alliances, starvation wasn't just a physical crisis, it was a spiritual unraveling. What makes Choco's collapse so chilling isn't the drought itself, it's how close they came to surviving it. Their engineers had built reservoirs and check dams to capture every precious drop of runoff. Their farmers developed drought-resistant corn varieties through generations of selective breeding. But complex societies have complex needs. When the rains failed year after year, even the most ingenious water systems couldn't conjure moisture from dry air. Soon, the cracks spread beyond agriculture. Trade networks collapsed as neighboring communities hoarded resources. Kivas that once hosted sacred ceremonies stood abandoned, their painted murals fading in the sun. The final days of Choco read like an eerie premonition of modern climate migrations. Families packed what little they could carry, corn grinders, ceremonial staffs, children's toys, and walked away from homes their ancestors had occupied for centuries. Some joined distant pueblos along the Rio Grande. Others dispersed into nomadic bands, reverting to hunter-gatherer lifestyles their great-grandparents had abandoned. Within a generation, the canyon's great houses became ghost towns, their doorways choked with wind-blown sand. Modern parallels scream from the canyon walls. Like the Anasazi, we've built civilizations in marginal environments, relying on technological ingenuity to overcome nature's limits. Like the Anasazi, we've created intricate systems that work beautifully until they don't. The difference: we have satellites warning us of droughts years in advance, global markets that can redirect grain shipments, and desalination plants that turn seawater into drinking water. But Choco's story whispers a sobering question. When the next megadrought comes, will our systems prove any more resilient than theirs? Yet hidden in the ruins of Choco lies a glimmer of hope. The Anasazi didn't go extinct, they adapted. Their descendants, the Pueblo peoples, still thrive in the southwest, carrying forward agricultural knowledge honed over millennia. The lesson isn't that civilizations must fall before climate change. It's that survival belongs to those who recognize when to cling to tradition and when to let go. The next time you bite into an ear of sweet summer corn, remember the Anasazi. Our most precious crops aren't just food. They're the seeds of civilization itself, and their roots only run as deep as the rain allows. The Norse settlers of Greenland didn't just live on the edge of the known world, they thrived there. For over 400 years, their farms dotted the fjords, their churches stood sturdy against the Arctic winds, and their trade ships cut through icy waters to bring back the lifeblood of their survival: European timber and iron. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities. Without sturdy oak planks, they couldn't repair their ships. Without iron, they couldn't forge nails, tools, or weapons. Their entire existence hinged on a supply chain stretching thousands of miles across treacherous seas. Then, one day, the ships stopped coming. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Trade voyages from Norway became less frequent, their holds carrying fewer goods each time. A broken axe here, a missing iron ingot there, small shortages that snowballed into crisis. By the mid-14th century, Greenland settlers faced a nightmare scenario. Their tools wore down to useless nubs, their ships rotted beyond repair, and no replacements arrived. Imagine a modern town suddenly cut off from steel, gasoline, or electricity. That was Greenland's reality. With no way to hunt seal or walrus effectively, protein dwindled. Without timber, they couldn't rebuild collapsing roofs or shore up barns against the cold. Even their churches, symbols of spiritual and communal strength, began to crumble. The last bishop of Greenland died in obscurity around 1400, his letters to Norway begging for supplies gone unanswered. But the real tragedy wasn't just the lack of goods, it was the lack of options. These weren't helpless people. The Norse had survived in Greenland for centuries by adapting, learning from the Inuit how to hunt on ice and sew warm sealskin clothing. Yet their cultural identity remained stubbornly European. They kept raising cattle ill-suited to the climate, wasting precious resources on barns for starving cows rather than shifting fully to seal hunting. They clung to iron tools long after the last shipment, repurposing nails into fishing hooks and recycling broken blades until nothing remained. Their pride became their prison. Modern excavations tell a haunting story. Archaeologists have found Norse farms where the final layers contain makeshift bone tools, desperate attempts to replace vanished iron. In one settlement, a blacksmith's workshop sat frozen in time, its anvil worn smooth from years of grinding down scraps. These weren't the relics of a sudden catastrophe, but of a slow, grinding collapse where every broken plowshare and splintered ore brought them closer to the brink. What makes Greenland's story so unsettling isn't just the supply chain failure, it's the human stubbornness that magnified it. The Inuit thrived in the same environment, but the Norse couldn't, or wouldn't fully embrace their methods. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history, societies clinging to what they know, even when it's killing them. Today, as climate change reshapes our world, Greenland's lesson echoes louder than ever. Adaptation isn't just about survival, it's about letting go of the tools that no longer serve us, even when they're the ones that built our world. The Norse didn't vanish because they were weak. They vanished because they couldn't imagine a future that didn't look like their past. And in the end, that's the most fragile supply chain of all, the one that runs from our hands to our hearts. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer, they built their civilization on it. In the world's first cities along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, barley wasn't just a crop, it was currency. Workers digging canals or building ziggurats weren't paid in coins or shells, but in daily rations of thick, nutritious beer, poured from clay jars stamped with temple seals. This wasn't just a quirky payment system, it was an economic engine that powered religion, labor, and social order for centuries. But when the salt crept into their fields, it didn't just ruin the harvest, it unraveled an entire way of life. The scale of Sumer's beer economy was staggering. Archaeological records from and Uruk show temple bureaucrats meticulously tracking barley distributions like modern accountants. A typical laborer earned 2 to 3 liters of beer per day, enough to provide calories, hydration, and a morale boost under the Mesopotamian sun. But beer's role went deeper than wages. It was offered to gods in elaborate rituals, binding the divine to the daily grind of human toil. The entire system functioned like a perfect loop. Barley grew in irrigated fields, workers harvested it, temples brewed and distributed it, and the cycle repeated. Until it couldn't, the first cracks appeared in the soil. Centuries of irrigation had left a poisonous gift, salt. As river water evaporated in the fields, mineral residues built up, slowly choking the life from the barley. Cuneiform tablets from 2100 BCE complain of black fields turning white, their yields dropping by half within decades. At first, the temples compensated by importing barley from upriver or cutting rations. But as salinization spread, even stopgaps failed. Workers who once sang hymns to beer gods now muttered grievances over watery brews. The social contract frayed. What followed wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a spiritual one. Without barley, temples couldn't brew beer. Without beer, they couldn't pay laborers or appease deities. The ziggurats that once scraped the sky stood half-built, their ramps littered with abandoned tools. Cities that had thrived for a millennium emptied like broken jars. By 1900 BCE, the heartland of Sumer was a shadow of its former self, its once bustling canals choked with silt and its great hymns silent. The lesson here isn't just about agriculture, it's about the invisible threads that bind economies to ecosystems. The Sumerians didn't collapse because they lacked ingenuity, their irrigation systems were engineering marvels. They collapsed because they couldn't see the slow poison accumulating beneath their feet. Modern economies might scoff at the idea of beer wages, but replace barley with oil, lithium, or even data, and the pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. When a society bases its survival on a single vulnerable resource, it's not building a civilization, it's brewing its own downfall. Yet buried in Sumer's ruins lies a twist of irony. The same salinization that doomed their barley may have spurred one of humanity's greatest innovations, the switch to more salt-tolerant wheat, collapse-forced adaptation. And that's the bittersweet truth of progress. Sometimes civilizations don't fall because they fail. They fall because they succeed too well at the wrong thing, until the land itself decides enough is enough. The Indus Valley civilization didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas. At its peak around 2600 BCE, their cities boasted grid-planned streets, advanced drainage systems, and a bustling network of ports stretching from modern-day Pakistan to Gujarat. But their true genius lay in their maritime reach. Archaeologists have found Indus seals intricately carved with unicorns and script as far away as Mesopotamia and Oman. These weren't just souvenirs, they were contracts stamped on clay like ancient barcodes, guaranteeing the quality of cotton, ivory, and lapis lazuli shipped across the Arabian Sea. Then the water vanished. Climate records reveal a slow-motion disaster. Around 1900 BCE, monsoon patterns shifted, and the mighty Gagga-Hakra River, the lifeblood of the Indus heartland, began drying into seasonal puddles. Without steady flow, ships couldn't reach inland ports like Mohenjo-Daro. Warehouses once stacked with trade goods stood empty, their inventories gathering dust. But the real tragedy wasn't economic, it was cultural. The Indus script, a writing system still undeciphered today, appears to have been tightly linked to commerce. As trade collapsed, so did the need to record transactions. Over generations, the very act of writing faded from memory, leaving behind thousands of inscribed seals that modern scholars strain to interpret. What's haunting isn't just the loss of language, it's the speed of forgetting. Unlike Egypt's hieroglyphs or Mesopotamia's cuneiform, which survived in monuments and royal decrees, the Indus script seems to have existed primarily for business. No grand stone inscriptions, no epic poems carved into temple walls. When the ships stopped sailing, the knowledge of how to read those elegant symbols evaporated like monsoon rain on parched earth. Excavations tell a silent story. Later layers of Indus cities show fewer and cruder inscriptions, as if the scribes themselves were losing their grip on the script. By 1800 BCE, the writing had vanished entirely, taking with it the names, stories, and laws of 1 million people. Modern parallels loom like storm clouds. Think of how today's digital records, from Bitcoin ledgers to cloud-stored contracts, depend on systems that could become unreadable if infrastructure fails or formats obsolete. The Indus didn't just lose trade, they lost their voice. Their collapse whispers a warning. Civilizations that tether their memory to a single, fragile system risk disappearing twice, first from the earth, then from history itself. Yet hidden in this silence lies a puzzle that tantalizes researchers. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus Valley shows no evidence of war or invasion during its decline. Their cities weren't burned, they were abandoned almost peacefully. Some archaeologists argue this points to a different kind of collapse, not a violent end, but a quiet unraveling as communities dispersed into smaller villages, trading literacy for survival. The lesson here isn't about fragility, but adaptation. Sometimes forgetting isn't failure, it's just another way to move forward. The next time you tap a screen to confirm a purchase, remember those Indus seals. The threads connecting commerce, language, and identity are older than we think and far more delicate. From Bronze Age merchants to Maya Jade kings, history's greatest lesson is this: no civilization is immune to supply chain collapse. Whether from climate change, political folly, or sheer overconfidence, these empires fell when their lifelines were cut. Today, as we rely on global just-in-time delivery, their stories aren't just fascinating, they're urgent warnings. Take a look around you right now. The device you're watching this on, its components likely crossed a dozen borders before reaching your hands, the food in your pantry. Chances are it traveled farther than your grandparents did in their lifetime. We've built a world where the average product journeys over 5,000 miles before it's consumed, a system so efficient it feels invincible. But history screams otherwise. The Romans thought Egyptian grain would always flow. The Ming assumed their silk monopoly would never break. The Maya believed jade's value was eternal. All of them learned the hard way that efficiency isn't resilience. Here's what's different about our modern predicament: speed. When Rome's grain shipments faltered, it took months for riots to erupt. When the Swahili coast's ivory trade collapsed, the decline unfolded over generations. Today, a single grounded container ship in the Suez Canal can trigger global shortages in days. A factory fire in Japan can idle car plants in Ohio by week's end. Our interconnectedness isn't just a strength, it's an amplifier of fragility. Yet buried in these ancient collapses lies a paradoxical hope. The societies that survived, whether the Pueblo peoples adapting after Choco or Venetian merchants pivoting from spice trades, shared one trait: diversification. They didn't bet everything on a single resource or route. That's the lesson etched into every ruin we've explored. Collapse isn't inevitable, but dependence is dangerous. The next time you hear about a microchip shortage or a blocked trade route, don't just see a headline. See an echo from Suma's salinized fields or Cahokia's exhausted copper mines. So where does that leave us? Not in doom, but in opportunity. We have something those ancient civilizations lacked: their hindsight. We know what happens when societies confuse complexity for strength. The choice ahead isn't between globalization and isolation. It's about building systems with shock absorbers, where failure in one node doesn't bring down the entire network. Hit subscribe to explore more historical mysteries, and let us know in the comments which modern supply chain keeps you up at night. Is it the semiconductors hidden in everything from cars to coffee makers? The rare earth metals without which our green energy revolution stalls? Or maybe something as simple as the humble shipping container, the unassuming steel box that holds our modern world together? History's patterns are clear. The only question left is whether we'll heed them before the next domino falls.